You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I always come to these companies with the mindset of scaling, increasing the revenue. It's always very important to have that at the back of your mind that building a relationship is key. Regardless of the fact that you have an amazing sales approach, you must also have an amazing product to complement your sales endeavors. You want people, you want your partners, you want stakeholders to get that sense of leadership, to get that sense of validation. In years to come, we're going to see a lot more innovative solutions. I don't think we've even scratched the surface.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest. We have Gerald Black, who is head of go-to-market at Anchor, which is a banking-as-a-service platform that lets you embed accounts, cards, payments, lending, and other financial features into your product. Welcome to the podcast, Gerald. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks a lot for having me, Tessa. I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's good to have you on the podcast. How's your day going so far?
Yeah, my day is going great. Having a regular day, just working and trying to get the best out of the day.
Brilliant. That's great to hear. I'm not sure if you've listened to the podcast before, but I usually like to start from the beginning. So introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Gerald Black.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm Gerald Black. Gerald Black is actually a brand name, a personal brand name.
Interesting.
Yeah, my given names are Gerald Okonkwo, right? But Gerald Black is fine as well. I like to look at myself as an ecosystem collaborator because I believe in the tech ecosystem and I actually believe in the impact it has made, across the world and across the continent, right? But driving a bit deeper, I currently head go-to-market at Anchor. And I also consult for a couple of startups via my consulting agency called Black.
Brilliant. So you've detailed there that you'd consider yourself as an ecosystem collaborator and given us a brief understanding of the multiple or various roles that you're currently working within. So I guess with your history and what you're currently doing, a lot of people might describe you as someone who is a serial entrepreneur. So I was hoping you can tell us a bit about your journey as a serial entrepreneur and how you got started in the world of startups.
Absolutely. So my journey started in 2012. I was in the university at the time. I was studying engineering. I actually read computer engineering, right? And at the time, we had to go on our compulsory CWAS program, which is also referred to as IT, industrial training. And I took a quite different approach, right? I mean, the regular approach is you find a company to work with to gain some experiences and all, right? But I actually identified some problems around and, I decided to try to solve those problems, right? And that was the issue of finding artisans to help you with home maintenance and repairs around the house or around the office because, we're having those challenges at the time. I remember my dad would always call me, even while I was in school, if I could refer someone to him because, I knew quite a couple of people around, right? So I decided that, if my dad was having those challenges, I could try to solve those problems, right? And I started a company called WeFix in 2012. Our core focus was to provide solutions to finding professional artisans and handymen, around and getting them to actually come in record time and deliver excellent services, right? This was not with the infusion of tech. This was just, a regular company where you reach out to us and they will try to make some arrangements to help you get kind of like play like the middleman, right? So I did this from 2012 And then I moved to Lagos after university. I moved to Lagos. This was in Delta State, by the way, in Nigeria. And then I moved to Lagos in 2015. And I can remember vividly, when I came to Lagos, I decided to work with a family friend for a while just to gain some experiences. And while I was doing that, I saw there was this entire hype about tech and what's happening in tech. We're having lots of conferences, the likes of Mark Essien or,
Yes.
Jason Njoku. Those were the glory days of the Jasons and, OOE and the rest of these guys, right? And, I found myself attending a couple of these conferences, quite exciting. And that was when I think I got beaten by the startup bug. And I decided to find a way to infuse tech and, the entire startup approach into what I was doing at the time. And then I pivoted from Wayfix to iFix, right? So iFix became a platform like an Uber for hiring artisans. So as opposed to the initial approach, we decided to come up with a platform where you could, if you're trying to hire a plumber, you can just go on the platform, hire a plumber, and then someone gets dispatched to you in record time and all of that. Right? It was quite exciting. We raised some, very early stage angel round. We raised about 50,000. And, we saw a couple of traction, and all right. But we were having serious challenges with scaling that idea. And I think that was typically, as a result of the fact that we are very, very big on community in, Nigeria. People prefer, as opposed to going to a platform, right? People prefer, to call a friend or call a family member, like, hey, Tessa, do you have a plumber?
Yes.
So we were not really seeing, so much traction. And then we felt, I think we're way before our time. And we probably need to shelve this idea or pivot to something else, right? And then, in 2018, we decided to pivot to vehicle care. This was primarily because it was very difficult to find like professional vehicle care artisans, so to say, or locations where you could go to and get like really professional vehicle care services like car wash, car detailing, and all. I'm sure you get a lot of that in UK. And of course, you see that happening in a lot of other Western parts of the world as well, right? But we were not seeing as much here. So I decided to, take a jump at it and try to solve that problem. And, I must tell you, there's something very important that we must all put into consideration, right? And that's product market fit, right? Because this was the product that we had that literally from month one, the revenues were insane. Like it was nothing close to what we had anticipated. We had a very successful run in our first month. And then we decided to expand, very quickly. And then we rolled out a franchise model where we partner with folks that are interested in running vehicle care locations. We provided the technology for payment, for pre-booking and finding the closest location to you and just driving into those locations to get a professional service, right? So this was called Packet, right? So we started Packet in 2018 and it was really successful. People loved the products, people loved the approach, people loved the convenience, and people really loved the professionalism that, we had put into the service offering, right? We partnered with the malls. I'm sure you're familiar with ShopRite.
Yes.
Yeah, so those malls that had ShopRite in them, they are really fancy and kind of like A-rated facilities. So we partnered with those malls, and then people would typically drive in for their grocery shopping. People would drive in to watch a movie and just pull up, right? So even without us driving so much marketing campaigns, we saw like really crazy organic growth because we were right in the center of the customers, right? I mean, it just made a lot of sense. You could kill as many birds with just one stone. So it really made sense. That was how Packet came to be. So fast forward to 2021, because we had seen really significant growth, growing the company from just one location to over 5 locations in 2 cities in Nigeria. And of course, we had planned to even expand beyond Nigeria, but we were approached by Fix It 45 Fix45 is an online platform for buying, selling, and of course, getting after purchase services. So they were interested in what we were doing. At the time, they had started Fix45, which was focused more on vehicle repairs, and everything after sales, right? So they started that and, they approached Packet to acquire the company and just to get a better approach to the market and all, right? So they acquired us. It was a very good offer, and then we jumped on it. We got acquired, and I joined Fix45 as vice president for business development. That was in 2021. I worked with Fix45 for about 7 months, and then I felt, well, I've been in the space for a while. I was looking for new opportunities. I wanted something different. I took a break from Fix45, just trying to rest and looking out for new opportunities, trying my hands on different things. And then, of course, I joined Black Ops as a community manager. Black Ops is a community for senior operators across venture-backed startups. So I joined Black Ops as community manager, just curating community activities and, ensuring that members get the best out of the community. And then a few months after that, I also joined Anchor as head of go-to-market, which is where, I currently work. Yeah, so that pretty much sums up my story leading up to this moment.
Brilliant. So you've given us a comprehensive overview of your startup journey, which started in 2012. You mentioned that you took an irregular or unconventional approach to enter the world of African startups. So you've worked with several startups through the years. I was wondering, what is your focus when working with startups? Would you describe your focus as unconventional or is it conventional?
Yeah, I would describe it as very unconventional, right? Because when I joined the startups, I have just one goal, which is, scaling and increasing revenue, right? 10x, 100x, just ensuring that we're able to hit our goals, and keep the company running, right? Because at the end of the day, revenue actually does matter, so regardless of, whatever activities you find yourself involved in the company, the revenue actually matters because it gets things going. So I always come into these companies with the mindset of scaling, increasing the revenue. And by increasing revenue, you first of all have to increase your product offerings, increase the value that you're actually giving to your users or customers. And you have to have that on lockdown. Then you see the ripple effect, which, at the end of the day, shows in your bottom line. Yeah, so basically, those are the core things that I do when I come into companies or the startups that I've worked in.
So you touched upon this slightly in terms of, as part of your role at Anchor, you oversee the complete sales cycle from pipeline generation, leads, closing across different target customer segments. Would you say that this approach differs when trying to implement, say, a sales cycle within the African startup space to how you would approach it in different markets outside of the continent?
Absolutely. I mean, first off, the African space is actually driven by communities, right? Well, we're very community oriented.
Yes.
And that means that, people really value relationships. This even comes into consideration when making key decisions for vendors, those kind of decisions, right? So when approaching, trying to close leads and even trying to prospect, it's always very important to have that at the back of your mind that building a relationship is key. So one of the first things I like to do is to get our customers, get our prospects, just get people around the community to basically put a face to the name, right? So let's sit down over drinks, like recently at Anchor, we had an open house. And the entire essence of the open house is to get people to become comfortable with people behind the Zoom meetings and the Google Meets. So you get to actually put a face to the name, build those really key relationships with the key contact people. And of course, you have to have credible service offerings. But at the back of that, you have to also establish really important relationships, right? So when you have that understanding, you approach it from a slightly different approach in terms of building those relationships and getting your customers to actually trust you and, enjoy working with you.
Brilliant, brilliant. So you've touched on in terms of building relationships is key to sales and generating leads within the African startup space. So if we look at it from a different perspective, how important is a strong sales and business development strategy for the success of a startup in Africa?
It's very important, right? Because it's not enough to have a brilliant product, right? We've seen scenarios where people had really terrible products. Their customer acquisition game is killing, right? So they find it really easy to acquire more customers. Because you could have an amazing product, but nobody knows about it, right? Now, the downside of having a bad product and having a really good marketing or sales strategy is that retention becomes really difficult, right? So regardless of the fact that you have an amazing sales approach, you must also have an amazing product to complement your sales endeavors so that it becomes easier to retain those customers over time. And even the way you prioritize your customers and the way you serve them actually goes a long way in keeping those relationships.
You mentioned having an amazing sales and marketing approach that complements a good product is key to success. So if we look at specifics, maybe you don't have to mention any names, but can you speak to any successful sales and business development strategies that you have seen African startups implement?
Yeah, so one of them is positioning yourself as an ecosystem leader because you want people, you want your partners, you want stakeholders to get that sense of leadership, to get that sense of validation. So you have to be very intentional in how you position yourself. And this even goes into the kind of events that you partner with on, the kind of events that you sponsor, the kind of speaking engagements that members of your team, not just founders, also members of your team go and get involved in, so that you just get a general sense of, wow, these guys are actually thought leaders or they're leaders in their industries and they're all working in this one company, right? So it gives that validation. And when you eventually approach partners or approach prospects, because one of the first things people do when you approach them is they try to look you up. Oh, who are these guys? Have I heard of them? And then they see that, oh, you're involved in hackathons, you're involved in global tech events, you're involved in speaking engagements. It just gives that validation that, oh, wow, these guys actually know what they're doing, right? So that has been a very effective approach to ensuring that, at least you're able to even get your customers buying.
Brilliant. You've detailed in terms of the importance of positioning yourself as a leader, which I guess is one strategy for successful sales and business development. So with your work, you mentioned in terms of what you do at Black Ops and the work that you're currently doing at Anchor and the work that you generally do in the Nigerian or Africa startup space. So with this in mind, how do you help African startups overcome the challenges they may face in terms of growth and scalability?
Awesome. So I will speak about this from Black Ops perspective, right?
Yes.
So over time, we realized that getting very good hires in African context, especially for operator roles, has been quite challenging, right? Because at the end of the day, operators are the people who are at the helms of affairs in these startups, helping to drive growth and success. So if you're having a general scarce in operators around the continent, then you're already setting yourself up for failure, right? So this is one of the challenge that the founder of Black Ops, which is Sheni Sulaiman, was able to identify early on. And he said, you know what, let's build a community for operators by operators, right? Operators across venture-backed startups that, have gained some experience. Let's all come together and find a way to refine those experiences, find a way to pass on those experiences, so that the next generation of operators coming will be properly equipped to handle the challenges from experiences of older operators who have treaded those paths before, right? So my contributions in Black Ops is one that ensures that we have continuity of experienced operators, continuity of people who can drive successful businesses, continuity of, generally passing down experiences and knowledge from one generation to the other, right? Because at the end of the day, founders can't do it all by themselves. They definitely need the support and help of operators who literally know what they're doing, right? So these are some of the things and key areas that we actually focus on just to ensure that, at the end of the day, we have a thriving tech ecosystem in Africa.
Brilliant. So if we look at this from a personal perspective, can you walk us through your experience or some of these strategies that you used growing and scaling your previous startup Pocket?
Okay, yeah. So for me, a couple of things really did it for me. And I think the first one is market feedback, especially when trying to get product market fit. Market feedback is really key because at the end of the day, you're serving your customers. Yeah. Regardless of the ideas that you have to sort of find a way to refine those ideas through the eyes of your customers, right? So you need to be very big on taking back feedback. You need to be very big on data because you need to know what works and what isn't working, and early on know what to cut off and then know what to push, right? So feedback and data, really, really important. I think another thing is finding the right people that generally will work with you to ensure the success. I think this is even the hardest part. You need to be very intentional about your culture. You need to be very intentional about the culture of the people that are coming to work with you. What are their goals? What are their personal ambitions? Because this also matters. What are their personalities? And of course, your investors, right? Because I must tell you, one of the things that helped us was that we had one or two angel investors that were particularly interested in what we were doing introductions, doing referrals. So it's not enough to just get money from these investors, especially at those early stages. You need investors who also are personally interested in building that business and are devoted to committing time to ensuring that the business is successful. So all of this, I would say, are some of the things that actually came together to help us build a successful company.
Awesome. So you've detailed that feedback, data, investors, and people were key to growing and scaling your previous startup Pocket. So what was the biggest challenge you faced when implementing those 4 elements when building the startup?
I think the biggest challenge was, first off, you learn through failures, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we failed a lot of times. We made a lot of mistakes before finding out what works. But I think if we had, and this is one of the things we don't get as much, if we had the opportunity to be mentored by people who had treaded those paths before. And that's why when I see mentorship, programs, I'm really excited about them, especially what, we are doing at Black Ops as well. Because if we had those opportunities early on, we probably would have been able to avoid a lot of mistakes. So those were some of the things that I would say personally we failed in. And then also knowing when to identify. And that's why I say data is very important, because data gives you feedback on what isn't working and what is working, right? So if you're not capturing data early on, which is something that we were also not doing, we're guilty of this. We were not very big on capturing data as to, what features or what products are actually driving success, and pushing harder on those products. If you're not capturing those, then you're actually going to be, how do they say it? You are spraying and praying, right? So, yeah. So I think those were the things that early on we actually failed at.
Thank you for sharing that. Earlier, you mentioned that investors were key to the growth of Pocket. So if we look at investors, What are some of the key areas or factors that you believe investors look for in startups when it comes to specifically sales and business development?
Okay, so I think the first one is having a brilliant solution to a problem that actually needs solving, right? So you're finding a very difficult area that has been a very big pain point, and you are, offering solutions to those pain points. That's key. Secondly, would be how scalable are those solutions, right? Because you definitely want to build a product that can scale, right? And scaling means, you can quickly grow from 100 users to 10,000 users without necessarily having to match the infrastructure, that you used in developing or acquiring those 100 users. You don't have to scale it proportionally to those 10,000, to what it would take to acquire 10,000 users, right?
Yes.
So, the same efforts and maybe a little more that you use in acquiring your 100 users, should also help you acquire 10,000 users, right? Across, various locations and geographies, right? So you need a solution that can scale. You yourself, as an individual, you have to be an investable person. You have to be someone who takes feedback, because investors are also very big on this. Because at the very early stage, you really have no traction to show. They are really betting on the team. So yourself and the team, have to be people that are investable, people that, they look at and they're like, oh, okay, I think I can work with these guys. And that's why having an A team, having a winning team is very key, especially very early on in the business, right? So yeah, these are some of the things that I would say investor. And of course, I almost forgot, having a very clear exit strategy from the beginning, right? So what is your goal? Are you building this to get acquired? Is there a clear path to how you intend to exit? Are you hoping that, someday you'll get listed in the stock exchange? So what is your plan, right? Are you trying to build a legacy company? So you have to actually have that at the very beginning, and make sure your visions, your ideas are actually communicated clearly, to all the investors that you're speaking to, or people, just people that are willing to bet on you, right? So those are very, very important.
Brilliant. You touched on a key point, which is that you have to be an investable person, which I really like and I agree with. So when Parkit was acquired by Fixit45, you took on the role of Vice President of Business Development.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was hoping if you could talk us through or just about your role as Vice President of Business Development and what were your responsibilities?
Okay, so I was responsible for identifying mutually beneficial opportunities to collaborate and partner with stakeholders across automotive ecosystem. So, some of the partnerships we had partnerships with CFAO, which is a leading European brand for both after-sales services and even vehicle sales. I was also responsible for, partnerships with Bolt, ensuring that drivers, Bolt, by the way, is a ride-hailing platform in Europe and also in some parts of Africa. So ensuring that the drivers get very good vehicle after sales services, repairs, maintenance, right? So some of those very key opportunities to collaborate and just build mutually beneficial partnerships that would also help us acquire a lot of customers, whether directly or indirectly. Those were the things that were my core responsibilities at Fixit45. So I was working directly with the CEO, first off, identifying those opportunities to collaborate and actually, taking on those opportunities head on and ensuring that, at the end of the day, we're able to close those partnerships.
Thank you for that. So we've spoke about your previous ventures with Fixit45, as well as your current activities or roles within Anchor, Black Ops, and you're also managing partner at Micro Black. So Gerald is an extremely busy guy.
You can say that.
So I was wondering, how do you balance the demands of running multiple businesses at once? And for the listeners out there, what strategies do you use to stay organized and focused?
All right, so I leverage a lot of tools. Like, for example, I don't joke with my Google Calendar,
Brilliant.
ensuring that I'm able to schedule my time appropriately, to deliver across my various functions, right? I also try to get as much rest as possible, right? Because rest, it refreshes you to get started with, the next thing, right? So I try to live a very scheduled and, very efficient life, right? So from the start of the day, I already have a proper schedule on all my deliverables for the day. And then I try to stick to them. I also have days where I just block off my calendar and I don't take on any meetings because I want to, spend those few hours just focusing on work and delivering on, all my deliverables, right? So these are some of the things that I use, in order to stay as effective and efficient as possible, right? And then I would also say I try to delegate as much as I can. And that's why from the, start or from early on, I template everything I do, right? So when I take a new responsibility,
yes.
I look at it from the very beginning of what I'm supposed to do till the very end. So say, for example, we're supposed to take on sales endeavor, I ensure I have a properly defined sales cycle, right? And at each step of the sales cycle, I have a proper documented step-by-step guide on what is supposed to be done. I have templates for cold messaging. I have templates for prospecting. I have templates for everything. So it makes delegating really easy because when I have someone I have to delegate a task to, I just share a template. Okay, just use this, follow this guide. And over time, I found out that it makes work really easy, right? So I think a lot of professionals should really spend time templating their activities. Because I hear when I have some side conversations with colleagues, sometimes I just wish I could replicate myself. And you can actually do that, right? You can actually do that. And the easiest way or the easiest hack to actually achieving that is templating everything, your responses, every single thing. Just find a way to template it.
I think it's something that I need to do more of. So maybe I'll be coming to you for some advice, Gerald.
I'll be happy to help.
Fantastic. So you've detailed your structured and intentional schedule and approach for day-to-day activities. So if we look at in terms of staying up to date with the latest trends and developments in the African startup space, what resources do you tend to rely on? Do you rely on online news, relationships, partnerships for information? How do you go about it?
I primarily rely on newsletters. I subscribe to a lot of newsletters across the ecosystem. So that's my first go-to. When those newsletters actually pop in my mail every morning, I spend some time just going through it and finding out, what's the latest news? What's the latest solution? What's happening, right? And then I also leverage events a lot, right? Because when you have a lot of meetups, you have seminars, you just have these tech events that people get to talk about trending topics or new tools or, general tech and ecosystem news. You get a lot of that from those events, right? So I leverage newsletters, I leverage events, and then I leverage communities like Black Ops because, for example, we have a community where we engage, a WhatsApp community, and then you see people sharing, a lot of insight on different industry topics, a lot of insight on tools, different insights, right? So I leverage this, core three things.
Fantastic. So with everything that you do, what role, this might seem like a very obvious question, but what role does technology play in the success of the businesses you're involved in and your day-to-day activities?
Yeah, so, without tech, we can't build the infrastructure that we leverage to extend a lot of our products, right? At Anchor, we're very big on infrastructure because that's what our partners and companies that we work with, that's what they literally integrate on their platforms, right? So we're able to build this because of tech. We're able to scale our offerings because of tech. I personally am able to stay organized because of the tools. I'm just picturing my life without these tools, without a calendar. So, like you said, it's very obvious. Tech has completely changed our lives. We're able to have this podcast because it's possible by the offerings that technology provides, right? So, yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. So tech is key to, I guess, not just your success, but the success of many people around the world. So if we stick to the theme of success, what do you think successful African startup founders apart from those who struggle to make it?
So I think the first one is having a very clear vision and sticking to your vision, right? Because a lot of times, some of the things we see happening is, especially when you start having investors, you have a lot of pressure to, because at the end of the day, everybody wants a return on investment. So there's that temptation to pivot from your original vision. Because at the start of what you're doing, you could definitely pivot your model,
yes,
but you should stay true to your vision, right? Because at the very core of what you're doing, there's that key understanding and key passion for something you're trying to solve, right? So having that and being very clear on that is very important because, you have a lot of rough times, you have, terrible times, but when you stay true to your vision, it helps you succeed. Another thing is, I think I've said this before, but having an A team that is also in line with your vision, right? So an A team that also understands what you're trying to achieve. And I think this is where a lot of founders fail because you could actually have an A team, but you haven't been able to properly communicate what the vision of what you're trying to build is, right? So you have to be able to transfer that passion by explaining and ensuring that everybody understands the vision, right? So what are we trying to do? Because pressure comes in different ways, especially as someone who has been a founder. Sometimes pressure from investors makes you forget why you started. You forget why you started this thing in the first place because you want to make sure you hit your ARRs. And so when you're having meetings, there's that temptation to completely forget why you started in the first place. Having a lot of emphasis on we need to hit our numbers, we need to make this money. So you have to actually be able to communicate your vision and have people who are actually interested in those vision, and are able to execute, right? So I think these things are really important.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. What advice would you give to any aspiring startup founders that might be listening to the podcast?
Okay, so I have advice I would love to share. I think the first one is ensure that you are able to identify a very big pain point when starting up a business. Ensuring that you are able to solve a very unique problem is important. And then ensuring that you get the right team is also as important. Now, we don't get to talk about this a lot, but building a very lean startup is also very important, right? So you don't want a startup that is heavy on, having a lot of assets, and at the end of the day, it makes it really difficult to scale, right? So ensure you have a scalable, lean model that, it's easy to grow from point A to point B, without literally having to replicate or increase the efforts that, you used in getting to point A. So that's also very important. Ensuring that you get the right investors early on, right, that actually believe and are passionate about what you're trying to solve. That really matters as well. Yeah, so I think these are some of the things that would be my advice to founders.
Thank you for sharing those important pieces of insight. During our conversation, we've spoken at length about the importance when it comes to sales and business development. So with that in mind, if we look at, say, trends in Africa's startup space, what trends in Africa's startup space with regards to the use of effective sales and business development are you seeing that you're currently excited about?
Yeah, so people are now warming up to the idea of startups in the first place, right? Because I think Africa hasn't even scratched its potentials in terms of what is possible and what can be done with technology. So I believe, we're just getting to that point where there's an awakening and everybody is beginning to realize the potentials that lie in using technology to drive solutions, right? I mean, one of the things we saw happening in the last 2-3 years is the adoption of cryptocurrency. I know a lot of times I saw publications from Binance saying that not just Africa, but even Nigeria is one of the highest. We have one of the highest users in terms of paying customers and users that are active on the platform, right? So that just tells you that there's this general awakening and people typically wanting to leverage solutions to solve not just their problems, but problems in communities, right? So so these are some of the trends I see happen. And I feel in years to come, we're going to see a lot more innovative solutions that are being driven by technology. I don't think we've even scratched the surface. I'll just give you an example. We still have high rates of cash transactions that are happening as opposed to other parts of the world, right? So that just tells you that even when we're referring to financial inclusion, there's still a lot of work to be done in ensuring that everybody is financially included, ensuring that we're able to have real solutions to real problems that also addresses these issues of cash transactions and people not having bank accounts and people not being able to access credit. So we have all of this now happening. Governments are now also beginning to get involved, also driving policies that help push this mandate, right? So these are some of the trends I see happening. And I feel, in years to come, we're going to see a lot more of this. And it's going to definitely help solve our problems.
Fantastic. So you mentioned that we're just getting started and haven't scratched the surface when it comes to the potential of African startups. So where do you see Africa's startup space in 5 years' time? I mean, you can speak about this quite generally, or if you want to approach it from a sales and business development perspective, where do you see us in 5 years' time?
Yeah, so I think, let me speak from a user acquisition and customer acquisition perspective.
Brilliant.
So I was having a conversation with someone about this a couple of days ago, and we're just talking generally about how adoption is slow compared to Western markets, how people generally are not warming up to technological solutions. And I think in the next 5 years, what we're going to see happening with the rate of internet penetration and digital inclusion, generally education, we're going to see a lot more happening in terms of how people now begin to, like at the beginning of our conversation, I told you the challenges we were facing with iFix and how adoption was really low.
Yes.
And one of the things that contributed to that failure and us pivoting from that business was the fact that the internet wasn't the primary place that an individual would think of to go to when trying to meet a need. But in the next 5 years, we're going to see a general shift where people are now beginning to think about leveraging the power of technology, leveraging internet. And this will be achieved because there's been a general penetration of education, and there's been better digital inclusion with the introduction of mobile devices that are now more affordable and cheaper internet access, right? We're now seeing a lot of this happening. And yes, next 5 years will really be exciting times where startups will, find it easier to scale because across the board, people are now just onboarded digitally and education has reached better depths.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and Anchor Black Ops in 5 years' time?
Yeah, so in 5 years, I'll speak about myself first, then I'll talk about Anchor. I've realized that my skill set acquired as a result of my entrepreneurial endeavors and just general years of experiences, having been an entrepreneur, has helped me develop a sense of becoming a sales specialist, a business development professional, right? What I'm beginning to do is I'm honing those skills and I'm beginning to position myself as a sales leader. And of course, not just using it for my personal or company contribution, but also ensuring that I'm able to become an ecosystem leader and passing down knowledge and experience to the next generation who are going to become sales leaders themselves, driving remarkable and awesome startups across the continent. So that's literally where I see myself. And that's why I'm very intentional with the Gerald Black brand, positioning myself now as an industry leader and, a leader in this vertical of sales and business development. And then for Anchor, what we're actually doing is different. I mean, we're building infrastructure that makes it easy for you to embed financial products. I'll just try to break that down as much as possible. Right? So what that now typically means is if you're trying to build a specific financial product for a niche market, let's say, for example, you're trying to build a bank for gigs, it now means you can do that in just a couple of days without necessarily having to think about the regulatory bottlenecks or the infrastructural bottlenecks or security compliance. We have all of that provided. So you're going to see companies like Anchor now sitting at the epicenter of driving this financial inclusion and financial growth generally across board, where people can now launch financial products to address specific problems and specific needs for unique problems across the continent. When you're thinking about building these financial products, prior to now, you have to think about, first of all, going to acquire those licenses. But the entire idea of banking as a service solves those problems, right? Because we have acquired all those regulatory requirements for you, and you can now simply integrate and launch in just a couple of days without having to worry about all of that, right? So it just makes financial inclusion much easier. It makes rolling out financial products a lot more easier, right? So in the next 5 years, Anchor is going to become an ecosystem leader as well, where, we're now driving and partnering with individuals and companies and startups that are looking to solve some of the biggest pain points that we have on the continent.
Awesome. I look forward to keeping in touch and seeing how that develops.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Yes, I do.
Brilliant.
It's not so much of a quote, it's more of a principle that I live by. And that's the fact that, every situation or any place you find yourself in is just a phase, right? And that's why consistency for me is very important, because just like a seed, you plant a seed today, you might not see anything happening in the next couple of months or even years, but you keep watering that seed and having that belief that it's going to sprout one day. So the same thing applies to us as individuals. When you find yourself in a certain phase and it seems like, you haven't achieved as much, just keep watering your seed, just keep building yourself. And one day you're going to have your platform. I mean, I never thought that I'll be invited to podcasts to come and talk about sales and talk about tech and the ecosystem, but here I am being invited to a couple of podcasts, invited to speak with Tessa. So that's just testament to the fact that, consistency really does pay, and just be consistent in anything you find yourself doing. With time, you'll be able to reap the rewards.
Consistency is key. It's one thing which I've tried to keep, especially with the podcast, trying to release an episode weekly. Yes, consistency is key.
Yes.
I like that, Gerald. Yes. Thank you for sharing. As we're coming to the close of today's conversation, do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are listening?
I would just say, hit the subscribe button and ensure you always listen to Unlocking Africa's podcast, right? Because you're going to have a lot of amazing speakers that are speaking about or talking about some very specific insights across the continent and how you can definitely unlock Africa's true potential. So thanks a lot for having me, Tessa.
Brilliant. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, Gerald. And obviously in the show notes, I'll leave some details how people can get in contact with you. if interested in exploring further the work that you're doing. So it's been a fantastic conversation. It's great to hear your story. It's truly inspirational, and I believe that it will inspire other budding entrepreneurs and startup founders. You've given great insight into how to scale and grow startups in an Africa context. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And we will speak soon.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.